Okay, let's do something interesting. What we're going to do is we're going to add another layer to this whole idea, and we're going to see whether or not we can write a actual almost usable Java application. What we're going to end up with is a sort of a text-based program that hopefully at some point we could put a GUI on the front and have something that we could actually use to do something. So in order to come up with an application, I decided I was going to make fun of people in soup. Any soup people here? Oh, good. Oh, wow. It's going to be lots of fun.
No,
okay.
Better watch them out.
Yeah, okay. So the problem that live with people way out there is they don't have much to do, and you know that they're sort of like living off in the backwoods, doing the hunting, fishing thing, and so I figured that what we would do is we would write a program that takes care of a fishing derby, okay, which seems to be a lot of what they do out there. So I think they actually have an annual fishing derby, if I remember correctly. Yeah, okay. So for those of you people who don't live in Souk, and maybe for those of you who do, let's figure out how a fishing derby actually works. And so I want to have everybody on the same page as to exactly what this whole process is going to look like. And then we'll turn around and we'll write the Java to make it happen. Okay? So, first things first, for the fishing derby, somebody comes out really early in the morning before it's light, and they put up a big sign on the beach that says Souk Fishing Derby 2013. And they put up a nice little registration desk, and they put some registration forms on the desk, and they sit and they wait for the fisher people to show up. Okay? So all of a sudden, people start showing up to register for the derby to start with. They take all of the registration requests, get them set up somehow, and then they turn around after the registration and they say, okay, 7 o'clock is the cutoff time or whatever, now let's start the derby. So they sound the big air horn, and everybody hops in their boats and they go out fishing. Okay? Sometime through the day, people start to return to shore with their fish. They can go out again, so they might make several trips, but sooner or later they arrive back at the registration desk. They're holding their big fish in hand, and they announce themselves, and they say, I'm so-and-so, and here's what I think is the biggest fish for the derby. Right? Hold on to this fish for me, and tag it, and we'll see if that's the biggest one. Right? So there's also that process where people are coming in and saying, here's my fish, deal with it, here's my fish, deal with it for a while. Eventually it starts to get dark out, so they sound the air horn again at some time, and now all of a sudden all the boats come in, and everybody rushes the registration desk and says, who won? Okay? So there's the basic process. Okay? So now let's take that process, let's walk through it one more time, and let's do it in a little bit more detail. We got the sign up in front of the registration desk. Fisherman arrives to turn around and wants to register. What information do they supply to register?
Name.
Yeah, first name, last name, probably whatever other information in their registration. Okay, so they walk up and they say, I'm going to register. What do you want to do with them when they register? What are they going to fill out? Just some piece of paper, some form that says, here's my registration form, right? Okay, got it. So everybody fills out their registration form. Let's walk out a little later after people have registered. Somebody comes back with a fish. Present themselves at the registration desk. They're holding onto this fish. They say, I'm so-and-so, here's my fish. What do we do now?
Mark it down on paper. Weigh it.
What if I want to save the weighing until later? What if I just how about if I just collect the fish to start with?
Go through the registration.
Where am I going to put the fish?
Or that person holding
Physically. Physically, what am I going to do with this?
Cooler. Staple it to the
like
wall.
whatever you got there.
Okay, suppose I've got a bucket for fish. How many buckets am I going to need? One for every person who's registered, right? Okay, so here's an idea. How about if I take the registration form that they filled out, and I'll walk over to this row of buckets that I've got behind the desk, and whenever they give me a registration form, I'll paste it onto one of the buckets, so I'll know that that's the fish for that particular person. That way they can catch as many as they want, and when they come along, I'm just gonna take their fish and dump it into the bucket. Okay, easy. Next question. When they bring their fish back, if I've got all of these buckets behind me, all with the registration forms pasted on them, and they come and they say, here's the fish, how am I gonna know what bucket to place it in?
Who's giving it to you?
So they're gonna provide me with first name, last name, and the fish. Now what do I do?
Search for the name.
Suppose I'm really dumb. Suppose I don't really know how to search for the name.
Give it to your servant.
What can they supply me that's gonna make it easier to do my search? What's the thing that I'm actually trying to match that's on the buckets?
Registration form.
The registration form. So what could they supply me at the front desk that would make my life easier?
Copy that. Another form.
Another registration form. So here's an idea. We'll take all those unused registration forms that we had printed up that nobody actually used because they didn't get enough registrants. And whenever somebody comes up with a fish, I'm gonna make them fill in the registration form that's sitting there with just their first name and last name. So what they're gonna hand me is a fish plus another registration form. Well, now it's really easy. I can walk over to the buckets that also have registration forms on them. I can take the registration form that they handed me along with the fish, and I can walk down the list of buckets until I find a registration form that matches the one that I've got in hand that's sitting on the bucket. Now what do I do when I'm at the right bucket? Just dump the fish into the bucket. What do I do with that second registration form? Throw it away, because there's still one pasted on the front of the bucket. Okay? So there's how we can handle matching people, which means that now I can send my little 6-year-olds out if they've got them floating around to go and say, hey, take that fish, and when you find something that looks like this on one of the buckets, dump it in, and I don't have to worry that it's gonna get to the right place. They don't even have to know their alphabet in order to do that. They just have to find a match. Okay, so now we've got a whole bunch of fish in buckets. Great. Fish, 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 line that along, multiple fish in the buckets. Horn sounds to end the registration, or to end the fishing derby. People come rushing the front desk, the registration desk, and just jumping up and down going, who won, who won, who won? How do I find out who won? All these buckets, all these fish, what to do?
Sort by weight.
Just find the max in each bucket.
It's gonna be, we want the biggest fish, really. So.
The one you grab would be the biggest until you find another one that's bigger.
But I've got multiple buckets here, and each bucket has multiple fish. This is gonna take me a while. If I'm sort of lazy, what could I do with all those fisher people that are standing around?
Get them.
Tell them to come back tomorrow.
How about if I take those fisher people who are yelling at me and wanting to know who won, and I'll make them stand in front of their buckets. Okay? Now when I come along and I want to see who won, what do I ask the first fisherman? Give me your biggest fish. Okay? So now I'm not worried about sorting through the fish. I'm just going to ask him to pull the biggest fish out of his bucket. Okay? What do I say to the second fisher person? Same thing, get me your biggest fish. So now I've got A standing with his biggest fish and B standing with his biggest fish. Now what? By asking A to talk to B and say, who's the biggest one? What do they do? This is the fun part. A standing there holding on to his biggest fish. B standing there holding on to his biggest fish. How do they determine which of them is better? Okay. Compare what?
Wait.
What have they got in hand? They can't, they're fisher people, right? But they're holding on to fish. Each of them is holding on to their biggest fish. So how do they figure out whether fish A is bigger or fish B is bigger? So much fun. introduce fish A to fish B and say to fish A, which one are you bigger or smaller than fish B? Okay, so all of the fishermen really have to do, they don't have to know how fish decide what's bigger. Fish can decide by length, they can decide by weight, they can decide that, you know, a 1 pound trout is bigger than a 100-pound tuna or whatever it happens to be, because trout don't grow as large, right? But it doesn't really matter. Just let fish A talk to fish B, and one of them will say, I'm bigger. And I go, oh, there's the biggest one I've seen so far. Okay? So I didn't worry about weight. Just let the fish decide. Okay? So eventually what we end up with is biggest fish talking to biggest fish all the way down. We keep track of which fishermen have the biggest fish, and suddenly we get to the end and we've got the biggest fish with the fishermen all set to go. Okay? So there's the process that we're going to use to discover who's got the biggest fish. Hopefully that sounds familiar at this point. Sounds like something we've done already. Okay, so let's start. Now that we know how it works, let's start the Java code. There's two ways that you can attack this problem. You can attack it from the smallest thing, because those are usually easy to identify because they're fairly tiny details. Or you can attack it from the big picture, which is the process of how does the fishing derby evolve, right? And then either way works. The problem with both of those techniques is that if you start from the smallest thing, as you run towards the largest thing, you tend to get confused in the middle because that's where things join together. And if you start from the largest thing and work towards the smallest thing, you still get confused in the middle. So the technique to use is actually to start from both ends at once. So we're going to write some of the smallest things until we get lost. Then we're going to write some of the larger things, the process, and then we're going to hopefully join them somehow in the middle. Okay? So let's start with the smallest thing. What's the smallest thing in this entire game? Smallest of all the pieces. Most specific thing? Most important thing? We'll go with the fish. Oops. Let's just cancel that. Make sure I pick the right folder. There we go. So we'll call that fish. Information to keep for a fish. I know we'll do it by weight. And just for fun, we'll keep the type of fish, not that we need it now, but we might need it later. So we'll have a fish constructor. And I guess we should have a getter for each one of those fields, and that's type. So we'll have a get type, and we'll have a get weight. And that's enough for a start. We'll fill the rest in later as we need it. Okay, so a fish is one of the things, one of the players in the game. What's the next level up? A fisherman, or just to be clear, let's work with a bucket. So every fisherman has a bucket, so we'll represent them as a bucket instead of using the word fisherman. So we've got a bunch of buckets, and every bucket has a first name, a last name, public bucket constructor. And we'll write the getters. And there's a bucket. More or less. Now what? Got a fish, got a bucket.
Where you put the fish into the bucket.
Oh, we could. What other things are we going to need?
Registration phone number, same number of the bucket.
Sort of starts to be eye-rolling. Not sure exactly. We could add a little bit of this, add a little bit of that. Now's the time, as soon as the eyes start to roll, to go back and say, well, why don't we write a main program first and see what happens if we do it from the other end of the spectrum. So we'll plug in a main program, and we'll do basically the process that I was talking about. So, here we are, first thing in the morning. What's the first thing that happens?
Horn goes on.
The what?
Horn goes on.
Before the horn.
Put up the sign.
Put up a sign first. So somebody walks up onto the beach and puts up a sign. So they're going to make a new derby with some name in it. Okay, so we should put this in a derby object, and I'm going to call it registration because we've been treating it like it's the registration desk. Okay. So I guess that means we need a derby class. And the derby class needs to hold on to a name for a start. And there's our derby class. What's the next thing that happens at the registration desk after the sign is up and somebody's sitting there? All of those Fisher people start showing up. So they show up and they talk to the registration desk. What do they say to the registration desk? What would you like them to say?
First and last name?
Well, what's the word? They talk to the registration desk and they say, I want to register. And what information do they supply to the registration desk? First and last name. Give that a try. And they would do something like that. Hey, my name's Fred Flintstone and I want to register. Okay, let's talk logistics here for a second. If they do that, who's supplying the buckets? We've got two choices in the game for the buckets. Either I can go out and buy a whole bunch of buckets from Walmart and I can have them sitting behind the registration desk, in which case I've had to pay out a whole bunch of money, and when they come along then and they say, hey, my name's so-and-so, I can paste their registration form onto the bucket. So I don't know. But the other alternative is bring your own bucket. So instead of me supplying the bucket, I can say, hey, if you want to register for this game, you bring me the bucket, and hey, put your name on it. Which makes my life easier. So the other way that we could see this written is to say, make a new bucket that has Fred Flintstone on it. Okay? So somebody else supplies the bucket, and then it's passed into registration. Somebody arrives at the registration desk with a bucket. Either way works, but this way is probably a little easier because the bucket comes from the outside world and we don't have to worry about it. So now we have, this is the Derby class, we have public void register, and the thing that gets supplied is somebody's bucket. They walk up to the registration desk, set this bucket on the top of the thing and say, there's my bucket, I want to register. What do you do with the bucket? Gotta have some place to hold on to this bucket. Modern Java holds on to bunches of things. A list. So we'll take every bucket and we'll add it to a list, and the list will hold on to all of them. So we'll make a private list of only buckets. And we need to make sure that that gets initialized. And do the import statements. Okay, so, oh, by the way, with array list, they made a change starting in the newest version of Java, Java 7, because people were annoyed with typing that word bucket over and over again when they pretty much always have to match. And so in the new modern Java world, you can leave out that word bucket and it'll still be happy. Okay, so it just saves you a little typing, and it figures out that it's still an array list that can only hold buckets. Notice you still need the angle brackets in there for a fake restriction, but it's the same restriction as list has. Okay, so somebody comes along and registers, they hand over the bucket. What do you do with the bucket? Name's already on it. Where are you going to put the bucket? Who's going to hold on to it? What variable? What variable in the class is in charge of holding on to things? All buckets. So we'll talk to all buckets and we'll say, hey, all buckets, why don't you just hold on to that bucket for us? And the list will keep track of it for us. Okay, so if you need to keep track of a bunch of things, in this case buckets, the list is a good choice. Okay, so the Derby has a list of buckets. What else have we got here? Okay, let's make a bunch of more people register. So Wilma will register with Barney. Okay, so there's a bunch of people who've all registered. Registration is closed. Now what happens?
You start fishing.
They start fishing. Okay? Throw out in the water fishing. Somebody catches something that they think is big, so they come back. They run up to the registration desk. What have they got in hand? Fish. And what do they say to the registration desk? Put it in which bucket?
My bucket.
Which is which one? How are they going to identify the
Give me
bucket?
a piece of registration paper.
Fill out a new registration form.
So they're going to say, hey, I'm Fred Flintstone and here's my fish. And you're going to turn around and you're going to look at the piece of paper and go, no, sorry, we've got these extra registration forms sitting here. Why don't you put your first name and last name on that, and I'll use that to go blank a bucket. Or better yet, same sort of concept, a little bit more physical. What could they bring you to try to match? A fish and what else? Not just a registration form, but another bucket that looks like the one that's behind the counter. So if they happen to have two buckets, they could, or they had a spare bucket, they could write their first name and last name on the spare bucket, because that would make it easier for me to run down and match bucket to bucket and go, okay, this bucket matches this other bucket, pretty easy to see whether or not they're a match. If they just give me a form doesn't necessarily match a bucket, or first name and last name doesn't necessarily match a bucket. Okay? But a bucket matches a bucket. And so if they supply an additional bucket along with their fish, life gets really easy. Find a matching bucket. Okay? So they're going to talk to the registration department, and they're going to say, add fish. And the thing that they're going to give is their fish. So somebody digs a koi out of their koi pond, trying to cheat. So they'll supply their fish, and the other thing that they supply is a new bucket. Looks like the other one, also got their name on it. So notice this is the bucket that's coming over the counter. It's not the original one, which is sitting behind the counter someplace. So they literally supplied a sample bucket. Here, find a bucket that looks like this. That'll be the one. Now buckets can match however they want. They can match by, they have to be the right color, they have to be the right size, they have to have the right name on the front, whatever you want for matching buckets, don't care. You just give me the one that looks like the one you want, and that's the one I'll go find. Okay? So we're talking to registration object, which is a derby. So we'll go into derby and we'll write add fish. And the thing that you're given is a fish and a bucket that looks like the one that we want. Okay, so they pass over the fish, they pass over the bucket. I take the two. I'm staring at my big long list of buckets. What should I do? Do we have something that does the comparing already?